At the disposal of the researcher working on the period of the Romanov dynasty's sunset is an array of documents that, in their structure and methods of recording, strikingly resemble the protocols of inquisitorial tribunals or investigative files on charges of heresy and state conspiracy. The entry point into this investigation is a yellowed folder from the archives of the Provisional Government's Extraordinary Investigative Commission, dated March of the year 1917. It contains not only the interrogation protocols of former ministers, but also an extremely specific document, Journal of External Surveillance on the Siberian Wanderer, compiled by agents of the Security Department. This document represents a dry, emotionless fixation of the subject's movements, meetings, and financial expenditures, known as Grigory Rasputin. Before we proceed to a detailed dissection of this machinery of power and system of shadow governance of the empire, I ask you to subscribe to our channel to support the development of documentary history and help us in the search for new archival evidence. The analysis of the political anatomy of the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 20th century requires a rejection of simplified interpretations about the mad elder and the weak Tsar. We are dealing with a profound crisis of institutional trust. After the events of 1905 and the introduction of the fundamental state laws of 1906, the traditional autocratic power faced the necessity of delegating authority to the Duma and the Council of Ministers. In this situation, a vacuum of legitimacy arose in the narrow circle of the high aristocracy, which sought to preserve personal access to the monarch, bypassing official bureaucratic channels. The figure of Grigory Rasputin became not the cause of this crisis, but its most radical instrument. His appearance in St. Petersburg in 1903 and subsequent introduction to the Alexander Palace through the Montenegrin princesses Milica and Anastasia Nikolaevna was a classic example of the infiltration of an agent of influence into a closed system. The mechanics of this influence were based not on mysticism, but on a concrete medical and psychological factor, the hemophilia of the heir to the throne, Alexei Nikolaevich. In conditions of the strictest secrecy surrounding the Tsarevich's illness, Rasputin became the sole informal operator capable of ensuring the psychological stabilization of Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. This created a unique situation in which access to the body of the monarch was controlled by a person without official status, who had not taken the oath of a state servant and was not included in the table of ranks. From the perspective of the archaeology of power, this was a restoration of the medieval court model where a favorite held greater weight than a minister, since his authority was not limited by law, but based on the sovereign's personal emotional dependence. The social composition of Rasputin's circle deserves a separate audit. It was not a homogeneous group of fanatics. We see here a complex coalition including representatives of the high clergy, such as Bishop Hermogen, whom Rasputin later skillfully sidelined from influence, representatives of financial capital, for example, the bankers Ignatius Manus and Dmitry Rubinstein, as well as careerist bureaucrats such as Alexander Protopopov or Boris Sturmer. The system of transmitting orders functioned through short notes from Rasputin, written in his characteristic clumsy handwriting, addressed to ministers and officials. According to investigative materials, these documents often contained direct instructions on appointments to positions or the allocation of subsidies. The Security Department recorded thousands of such episodes. The effectiveness of these notes was explained by the fact that officials perceived them as a transmission of the empress's will. Thus, a parallel vertical of power was constructed, where loyalty to the elder was converted into career advancement. The question of orgies and Rasputin's moral character in this investigation is considered exclusively as an element of disinformation warfare and a method of political discreditation. If we turn to the reports of the surveillance agents from the Security Department who conducted round-the-clock observation under the codename Dark One, we will see a picture that substantially differs from the newspaper slanders of that time. Most of the recorded boozes in the Yar restaurant or at the apartment on Gorokovaya Street were chaotic gatherings where Rasputin demonstrated his closeness to power in front of supplicants. From an institutional perspective, these events served the function of an informal appointment exchange. However, it is important to critically evaluate these reports. The police department found itself in a dual position. On the one hand, the Minister of Internal Affairs demanded compromising material. On the other, Emperor Nicholas II directly ordered an end to interference in the personal life of our friend. This led to rumors and third-party retellings entering the agents' dispatches, making them sources of low verifiability regarding sexual exploits, but extremely valuable in recording the list of visitors. Rasputin's connection to the Klist sect, God's people, within this study is regarded as a technological base for creating a network of informants. The Klist ships represented closed cells with a rigid hierarchy and a system of mutual support. Rasputin's use of the rhetoric and practices of this movement allowed him to recruit supporters among the common folk and the lower clergy, creating an illusion of popular representation before the Tsar. This was a specific form of political lobbying, disguised as religious zeal. According to the interrogation of Theophan of Poltava, Rasputin employed the technique of confession to gather compromising information on representatives of high society, which enabled him to carry out soft blackmail and manipulate personnel decisions. The logistics of the conspirators' meetings and the methods of information transmission from 1914 to 1916 became a factor in national security. Amid the conditions of the First World War, the Rasputin Camarilla began to exert influence on strategic decisions. The appointment of Boris Sturmer as chairman of the Council of Ministers in January 1916 was perceived by the public as a victory for the German party and Rasputin personally. The correspondence of the Empress with Nicholas II, who was at headquarters in Mogilev, confirms that Rasputin's advice on military matters, for example, on the timing of an offensive or the replacement of the commander-in-chief, was conveyed to the monarch in a categorical form. This was a destruction of staff culture. Decisions were made not on the basis of intelligence data and logistical calculations, but on the visions of an outsider. A critical audit of the failure of this shadow structure shows that its demise was predetermined by a complete loss of connection with reality. By mid-1916, Rasputin and his entourage had ceased to take into account the interests of the Grand Dukes and the army command. A coalition of state salvation emerged, which included far-right politicians, Vladimir Purishkevich, representatives of the imperial family, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and the high aristocracy, Prince Felix Yusupov. An analysis of the preparations for Rasputin's elimination reveals the dilettantism of the conspirators in technical execution, but absolute resolve in the political goal. According to the testimonies of Yusupov and Purishkevich, which should be treated with caution due to their desire to portray themselves as patriot heroes, the operation to deprive Rasputin of life on the night of December 17, 1916, in the basement of the Yusupov Palace on the Moika was a series of errors. The use of potassium cyanide, which, according to some accounts, was neutralized by sugar in the pastries or replaced with a harmless powder by one of the participants, led to the prolongation of the process of physical suppression. Rasputin's death did not save the monarchy, which confirms the thesis that he was merely a symptom of systemic decay. The investigation into the matter of his elimination, conducted by the director of the police department, Alexei Vasilyev, was effectively paralyzed by intervention from above. The list of seized property from the apartment on Gorokovaya Street after the elder's death turned out to be surprisingly modest. A few hundred rubles, a gold cross, a gift from the Tsar, and a huge number of petitions. Most of the financial flows passing through him did not settle in his pockets, but were distributed among intermediaries and operators of the system. Rasputin's archives were partially destroyed immediately after the February Revolution, but the surviving fragments of financial correspondence from his secretary, Aaron Simonovich, confirm the scale of corrupt schemes involving the sale of positions and exemptions from military service. The documentary epilogue of this story is reflected in the materials of the Extraordinary Investigative Commission. The legal system of the Russian Empire proved powerless against informal influence. There was no article in the laws for illegal advising of the monarch. The experience of Rasputinism led to the introduction in the legal frameworks of later periods of concepts such as lobbying and conflicts of interest, though in the conditions of autocracy these notions were inapplicable. The story of Grigory Rasputin is not a tale of mysticism, but a report on the degradation of state institutions when personal loyalty replaces professional competence and shadowy channels of communication become more important than official protocols. The physical cessation of the subject's existence in December of the year 1916 served merely as a prelude to the complete dismantling of the imperial machinery of governance, which had lost its ability to self-purify from destructive elements. Continuing our analysis, it is necessary to delve deeper into the financial aspects of the functioning of Rasputin's circle, which, in the context of early 20th century history, is equivalent to studying the bank accounts of the Templars or the financial operations of the Vatican. From the year 1910 to 1916, significant sums passed through the elders' trusted agents, directed towards supporting certain banking structures. In particular, the activities of banker Dmitry Rubinstein were closely linked to information leaks from the highest echelons of power. According to data from military counterintelligence, monitored by General Mikhail Batushin, there were suspicions of using Rasputin's proximity to the court for conducting speculative operations on the stock exchange with shares of military factories. This shifts Rasputin's figure from the category of spiritual mentor to that of a key link in the chain of insider trading. In the protocols of interrogations of Manusevich Manuilov, a former Okhrana agent and one of Rasputin's close associates, a clear scheme of extortion of bribes from entrepreneurs in exchange for protection in the ministries is traced. Every appointment, whether as deputy minister or head of state railroads, had its own rate. According to the report of General Vladimir Dzunkovsky, attempts to cleanse the court of this influence encountered a wall of the Empress's personal animosity toward anyone who dared to criticize the holy man. Thus, we see a classic example of the blockage of feedback mechanisms within the governance system. When state security institutions, the police department and the gendarme corps, begin to work not for the protection of the state, but for concealing information about the destructive activities of a favorite, this inevitably leads to catastrophe. Particular attention should be paid to the study of the so-called ministerial leapfrog, or ministerial merry-go-round of 1915 to 1916. During this brief period, 4 chairmen of the Council of Ministers were replaced, along with 4 ministers of internal affairs, 3 ministers of justice, and 2 ministers of war. Each of these appointees passed through the filter of approval in the apartment on Gorokhovaya Street. Analysis of the correspondence between Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna and Nicholas II allows us to reconstruct the approval procedure. Our friend asks you to pay attention to Protopopov. Our friend thinks that old man Sturmer will be in place. In the conditions of absolute monarchy, these formulations had the force of legislative acts. The tragedy lay in the fact that people selected in this way often suffered from mental instability, like Alexander Protopopov, or complete professional incompetence, like Boris Sturmer. This was a deliberate selection of the worst, since it was precisely such cadres that ensured the unimpeded functioning of shadowy schemes. An important aspect of the archaeology of power in the Rasputin case is the study of encryption methods and message transmission. Since direct communication between the Siberian peasant and the emperor was hindered by protocol, the role of interface was played by Anna Virubova. Her house in Tsarskoye Selo served as the main location for meetings. During a search conducted after February 1917, notes were found in her papers whose content confirmed the coordination of actions between Rasputin and German agents through Swedish banking circles. Although the commission found no direct evidence of state treason in the form of espionage on behalf of Germany, the very fact of the existence of such communication channels bypassing the foreign ministry and the general staff created a critical vulnerability for the empire. Criticism of sources from the 1917 to 1920 period requires special caution. The memoirs of Felix Yusupov, published in Emigration, represent an attempt to justify the breach of oath and the act of depriving life by framing it as a patriotic act. Yusupov describes Rasputin as a demonic figure possessing supernatural power, which contradicts the medical reports of pathologist Professor Dmitry Kozorotov, who performed the autopsy. The autopsy report states that the cause of death was 3 bullet wounds to vital organs, and no traces of poison were found in the stomach. This indicates that either no poison was administered or it was of poor quality. The mythologization of Rasputin's death was necessary for the conspirators to emphasize the infernal nature of his personality and thereby absolve themselves of responsibility for an ordinary political assassination. The documented reaction of the imperial family to Rasputin's death is also an object of historical analysis. The isolation in which Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna found themselves reached its peak. The funeral of the elder in Tsarskoye Selo, attended only by family members and Anna Virubova, became a symbolic break between the monarch and the nation. In the eyes of the officer corps and the bureaucracy, this was final proof that the private interests of a narrow circle of individuals had been placed above the interests of state stability. The further development of events, including Nicholas II's abdication, was largely predetermined by the paralysis of will that set in after the elimination of their chief advisor. The impact of this incident on the legal system was paradoxical. The investigation into the Rasputin case, conducted during the provisional government, became the prototype for trials of representatives of the old regime. It demonstrated the impossibility of criminal prosecution for abuse of influence within the framework of the legislation in force at that time. All charges against the Camarilla collapsed due to the lack of direct evidence of corruption. Money was transferred in cash, without receipts, and appointments were the prerogative of the monarch. This failure of justice pushed radical forces toward the idea that the old system was not subject to reform but had to be destroyed completely. Thus, the study of the phenomenon of Grigory Rasputin, using methods of historical paleography and structural analysis, reveals not a mystical secret, but a technological scheme for capturing power through the exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities in the highest leadership. This is a story about how the disorganization of institutions leads to the emergence of parasitic structures capable, in the shortest possible time, of bringing a vast empire to political bankruptcy. The fate of the archives of this period, partly burned in the bonfires of the revolution, partly plundered, leaves us with only fragmentary evidence. But even these scraps are enough to reconstruct the anatomy of one of the most large-scale political conspiracies in world history. Every word in Rasputin's notes, every entry in the agent's diary, and every financial control report, these are elements of a complex puzzle that we continue to assemble in order to understand the mechanics of the fall of great powers. In analyzing the institutional consequences of Grigory Rasputin's activities, one cannot ignore the influence of this phenomenon on the Orthodox Church. According to the Synod's report from 1912, the elders' activities were regarded as a form of false prophecy that undermined the authority of the official church hierarchy. Rasputin's confrontation with the Synod's chief prosecutors, such as Siberian, demonstrates how an informal leader could dictate terms even to a conservative religious institution. Appointments to the highest church posts, including the rank of Exarch of Georgia or Metropolitan of Petrograd, became dependent on the favor of the Siberian wanderer. This caused deep ferment among the clergy, which ultimately welcomed the fall of the monarchy, hoping to be rid of the Rasputin yoke. Thus, the archaeology of power shows that Rasputin became a wedge driven between the throne and the altar, two pillars of imperial statehood. Examining the logistics of Rasputin's stay in Petrograd, we see a precisely calculated schedule. The morning began with receiving supplicants, whose lists were pre-filtered by Anna Virubova or Secretary Simonovich. This was followed by visits to ministries or telephone conversations with high-ranking officials. The use of the telephone in the 1910s was an important technical advantage. Rasputin actively employed this means of communication for prompt intervention in affairs. Records of wiretapped phone conversations, preserved in the funds of the Petrograd Security Department, capture his crude, imperious tone in dealings with ministers. These documents are an invaluable source for understanding the atmosphere of fear and sycophancy that reigned in bureaucratic circles. Special attention deserves Rasputin's role in economic planning during the war period. According to a note from Finance Minister Peter Bark, Rasputin proposed utopian and economically harmful projects, such as unlimited emission of paper money to cover military expenses, which ran counter to the gold standard policy. Although these ideas were not fully implemented, their very discussion at the highest level introduced disorganization into the work of the financial department. This confirms that Rasputin's sphere of influence extended far beyond healing the heir. He sought to control the state's key resources. A critical audit of the empire's failure in 1916 is impossible without considering the Rasputin factor as a catalyst for revolutionary sentiments in the army. The spread of caricatures and leaflets depicting Rasputin in intimate closeness with the Empress took on the character of an epidemic on the front. Military censorship was powerless to stop this flow. soldiers saw in this betrayal and German influence. The historical truth here lies in the fact that even in the absence of evidence of treason, the very existence of such a figure at the throne made the power morally illegitimate in the eyes of the warring people. This was a communicative failure of colossal scale. The monarchy could not, or did not, want to explain to the people the role of this man, leaving room for the wildest speculations. Concluding our study, we must turn to the fate of the seized documents after Rasputin's death. The bulk of his personal correspondence with the Empress was returned to the Alexander Palace and subsequently destroyed by order of Alexandra Fyodorovna. However, copies made by counterintelligence agents and discovered in the archives of Gurko and Junkovsky allow us today to reconstruct the content of these messages with a high degree of accuracy. They are devoid of eroticism, but full of mutual support and discussion of specific political moves. Rasputin appears in them not as a lover, but as a spiritual shield and political advisor, whose recommendations were perceived as divine revelation. The influence of this precedent on the subsequent history of state governance is difficult to overestimate. The figure of Rasputin became a classic example of the gray cardinal, whose presence in the system signals its deep defeat by corruption and loss of manageability. From the perspective of a medievalist, this was a return to the times of the Dark Ages, when personal magic and closeness to the leader meant more than a code of laws. Studying the Rasputin case through protocols and financial reports allows us to lift the veil of mysticism and see behind it a harsh, cynical, and effective, in the short term, machine for exploiting state power for personal and group interests. The fate of the conspirators' archives is also of interest to the researcher. Felix Yusupov, until the end of his days in Paris, kept some relics related to that night on the Moika, turning them into objects of cult for a certain part of the emigration. However, for us, the materials of the official investigation are more important, which recorded attempts to destroy evidence. Washing away blood on the snow in the palace courtyard, attempts to hide the participation of Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich. This episode demonstrates that even under conditions of mortal threat to the state, the aristocracy tried to preserve caste solidarity and get their own out from under the law. Thus, the archaeology of power leads us to the conclusion: the Rasputin affair is not a random glitch in the system, but the logical finale of an authoritarian regime that refused to modernize institutions in favor of maintaining personal control through dubious intermediaries. This is a lesson about how dangerous it is to destroy the boundaries between the ruler's private life and the state apparatus. When these boundaries are erased, figures like Grigory Rasputin inevitably take the stage, whose influence is directly proportional to the degree of closeness and opacity of power. In the end, it was precisely the absence of publicity and government accountability to society that made possible the existence of this mystical influence, which turned out to be quite earthly, logistically calculated, and financially motivated mechanism of the empire's destruction. The text of this investigation, grounded in the analysis of primary sources and the critique of subjective testimonies, demonstrates that history is above all a science of documents and facts. We see how, behind the screen of legends, there lurks a dry chronicle of the degradation of governance, where each event bears its number in an archival folder and its price in a bank ledger. The experience of Rasputin endures in history as a cautionary tale of what transpires when mysticism supplants politics and favoritism the law. The investigation is complete, But the archives continue to harbor their secrets, awaiting new methods of analysis capable of casting light on the shadows of the past without recourse to epithets or conjectures, guided solely by the cold light of historical truth.